Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly behind the velvet curtains of a candlelit Tudor palace, where everything smells a little like beeswax, damp stone. And whatever the queen decided to wear today, probably rose water, cloves, and maybe just a hint of something suspiciously like vinegar. The year is 1585. The halls are drafty. The beds are stuffed with straw. And you lucky you are about to become the most trusted servant to the Virgin Queen herself. You'll need to hold your nose, because tonight's story is about Queen Elizabeth I, the most powerful woman in England who may or may not have bathed only once a month. And you probably won't survive this, not because it's too gross though. Fair warning, it is. But because the idea of hygiene was just different, like dangerously different. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Drop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake to the gentle creak of floorboards, the quiet crackle of a low fire, and the rustle of heavy skirts. Queen Elizabeth is already awake, already being dressed not by one person, but by at least four. And that's before her hair is arranged, before the cosmetics are applied, and certainly before she faces the kingdom with a composed, unshakable glare. But there's one thing that doesn't happen during this royal morning routine, a bath. In fact, there may not even be one scheduled this week, maybe not even this month. You hear her say at once, sharply, to a whispering lady-in-waiting, I take a bath once a month, whether I need it or not. It sounds like a joke, but was it? Historians still argue whether that line was sarcasm, clever deflection, or sincere policy. What's clear is that running water was not trusted. Not by Elizabeth, and not by most of 16th century Europe. Why? Because water could kill you. At the time, the dominant medical theory was called humorism, which you probably won't find very funny. The belief was that your health depended on the balance of your bodily fluids, or humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Bathing could supposedly open the skin's pores and let in bad air or unbalanced moisture. You weren't cleansing yourself, you were risking your very soul leaking out. So people got creative. Elizabeth didn't need a bath, they said. She had linen shifts. The undergarments worn beneath her dresses. These were changed daily, sometimes multiple times a day. The idea was that clean linen would draw out the sweat and dirt from the skin. Think of it as medieval osmosis. You just wear your washcloth. She also used rosewater, vinegar, and perfume in generous quantities. The royal apothecaries mixed intricate blends of herbs and oils to keep her smelling, well, less like a person and more like a flower shop that's seen some things. And it worked, kind of. You lean in close during one of her dressing sessions and watch as her ladies dab her wrist with something sharp and floral. They're not just sending her, they're protecting her. In their eyes, rosewater is armor. It's cleanliness without risk. But not all the smells are so elegant. Elizabeth, like most people of her time, sweated. She walked through smoky palaces, sat for hours in heavy velvet, danced with courtiers who had probably never seen a bar of soap. Perfume can only do so much. So there were fans, fragrant handkerchiefs, and rooms filled with dried lavender. Here's a weird one. It's believed that Queen Elizabeth had her own personal scent, not something you find bottled and sold in a shop, but a signature mix of perfume and body odor that became, well, familiar, royal even. It's said that some courtiers actually missed the scent when she was gone. Either that, or they were just happy it wasn't someone worse. And that brings us to another fact. In the grand scheme of Tudor hygiene, Elizabeth was actually considered clean. This is a woman who owned more than 600 dresses, had a staff of people dedicated to keeping her skin pale and powdered, and absolutely refused to be seen in a state of undress ever. But all of this careful curation meant very little scrubbing. Water was for drinking if you were brave, or for ritual hand-washing before meals. Full immersion. A risk. A scandal. A last resort. Remember, there were no indoor plumbing systems. No hot showers. No rinse and repeat, just big wooden tubs dragged into rooms, filled with buckets of heated water, and sponged on by hand. You didn't bathe casually. You prepared to bathe. And you didn't do it unless you had at least 3 servants and nowhere to be for the next 6 hours. Even so, there's a record of Elizabeth ordering bathtubs and talking about warm water. Some say she bathed more often in private. Maybe the monthly line was just her being coy. Others say she stuck to it rigidly. After all, she ruled by image, and an air of untouchability suited her. Here's the kicker. One of her suitors, the French Duke of Anjou, was apparently so shocked by English hygiene that he sent complaints home about the smells of the island. Which, honestly, is fair. Still, if anyone could make not bathing fashionable, it was Elizabeth. And you, lucky dream walker, get to stay closed nose wrinkling slightly while the Queen of England conquers the world in a cloud of musk orange, blossom, and possibly yesterday's sweat. You follow the Queen now not just through corridors thick with tapestries and drafty corners, but into the deeper workings of her world, where royalty meets reality. There's a strange kind of intimacy here. You're no longer just watching her be dressed. You're moving through the palace itself, tracing the invisible systems meant to keep her spotless, without ever needing to wash. And here's where it gets weird. The royal palace has no plumbing, no pipes, no drains, no flowing water on command. You're in Richmond Palace, or maybe Hampton Court, both favored haunts of Elizabeth. The walls may be gilded, the ceilings carved, but underneath, it's chamber pots, basins, and an army of servants who carry filth away in buckets. Let that sink in. You tiptoe past the privy chamber, the Queen's most private space, which somehow includes a literal privy, the royal toilet if you can call it that. Is an elaborate, cushioned chair with a hole cut in the seat. Beneath it, a ceramic bowl. That's it, no flushing. Just hope someone remembered to light incense. And someone always did. In fact, Elizabeth had a personal groom of the stool. That was a real job title. One lucky nobleman was chosen to manage the Queen's most personal moments. And surprisingly, this wasn't a punishment. It was an honor. The groom had unmatched access to the monarch. He'd assist during dressing, manage her toiletries, and, yes, ensure the chamber pot was emptied with utmost discretion. You wonder if the groom of the stool bathed more often than the Queen. Hard to say. But let's talk about what happens after. You'd think the chamber pot contents were whisked away to some secret, enchanted Tudor sewage facility. Not quite. Most of it was dumped in cesspits or night soil trenches, literal ditches filled with human waste. If you're picturing someone hauling a full bucket down a stone hallway while trying not to spill it on their shoes. Yes, that's accurate. Now multiply that by a full court. Hundreds of courtiers, nobles, and servants all needing the same basic facilities, with no system more advanced than dump it far away and don't look back. And that's just the toilets. What about bathing? If Elizabeth ever did take a bath, it was a production. A wooden tub, probably lined with linen, would be brought to her chamber and filled with water heated in copper kettles by kitchen staff, and carried up, bucket by bucket. That meant dozens of trips up narrow stairs. The water cooled quickly. And unless the Queen wanted to wait another hour for a refill, she bathed in lukewarm suds, which might explain why she didn't bother. You pass through the still room now, the place where herbs were dried and potions prepared. This is where her perfumes were mixed: lavender, marjoram, rosemary, and rose, all steeped in alcohol or vinegar, strained through linen, and poured into elegant glass bottles. You imagine her splashing a bit behind each ear, not to seduce, but to survive, and her bedchamber, not as pristine as the movies would have you believe. The Tudor idea of clean was mostly about ritual and presentation. Floors were covered in rushes, long grasses thrown down, and sometimes perfumed with herbs. But those rushes weren't changed often, and beneath them, bits of food, fallen hairpins, crumbs, dirt, and probably a few things best left unnamed. Here's your quirky detail for the night. Sometimes orange peels or flower petals were tossed onto the floor along with the rushes to mask smells. So while you might step on something squishy, at least it'll smell faintly citrusy. Still, not everything stinks. Occasionally, you pass a courtier who's freshly scented, not bathed, just dabbed. Powdered wigs and perfumed gloves were trendy imports from France. Elizabeth herself was fond of gloves and gifted perfumed pairs to favored nobles. Think of it like the Tudor version of handing out branded merch, but underneath the scented gloves. And behind the powdered makeup, hygiene was a bit of a guessing game. Doctors in her court sometimes recommended sweat baths where you'd sit wrapped in linens and sweat out the bad humors. Kind of like a medieval spa day, except you don't end up any cleaner, just sweatier, and still unbathed. Historians still debate whether these treatments were effective or just theatrical. Did Elizabeth secretly believe in them, or was she just going through the motions for the sake of the court? The truth is, bathing wasn't considered healthy. It was risky, destabilizing, and to some, even sinful. Monks in earlier centuries had bathed regularly, sometimes weekly, but by Elizabeth's time, even the monasteries had scaled back. Water was no longer sacred. It was dangerous. That said, there were bathhouses in London, public ones, but those were mostly used by the lower classes, and more often for, let's say, social reasons than hygiene. The Queen would never set foot in one. She had her own methods. She may have believed, genuinely, that frequent bathing would make her ill. Or, more likely, that maintaining her carefully polished image required staying dry. Because once you bathe, the makeup runs, the powder cakes, the illusion of perfection cracks. So instead, she leaned on her daily routines, changing shifts, scented gloves, and the occasional perfumed apple hidden in her bodice. Yes, that was a thing. And you, now drifting through her world like a ghost with a good sense of smell, are starting to realize something odd. No one finds the strange to be clean. In Elizabeth's time, wasn't about being scrubbed down or sanitized. It was about being controlled, composed, aromatic. And in that sense, Elizabeth was spotless. You're beginning to notice a pattern. Every corner of the palace is saturated in ceremony: how you speak, how you eat, even how you stand in the Queen's presence. Cleanliness, it turns out, is no exception. You keep expecting to stumble across a bath chamber, or even a little stool with a bowl of soap and water. But all you ever find is linen, perfume, and pride. And now the line returns to you again. I take a bath once a month, whether I need it or not. You heard her say it, but it echoes oddly in your mind. Was she being clever, passive-aggressive? Or did she mean it quite literally? That quote, famous, oddly endearing, is repeated again and again in biographies, YouTube videos, and the occasional eyebrow-raising history meme. But historians still argue whether Elizabeth actually said it, or if the line was attributed to her later as a kind of satirical shorthand. A punchline passed through centuries of polite horror. Still, it stuck, because the idea of England's most iconic monarch refusing to bathe more than once a month is just too perfect. It confirms everything we suspect about the Tudor period: dirt, superstition, corsets, and all. But dig a little deeper, and things get murky. First, consider the context. Elizabeth ruled for 44 years. That's over for decades of recorded behavior, meticulous court reports, and daily accounts. And yet, there's almost no solid documentation of her actual bathing habits, no schedule, no record of frequency. The only surviving notes refer vaguely to her having a bath or ordering one installed. Even her own physicians barely mention it. So, where did the once-a-month idea come from? Some trace it to diplomatic correspondences, like those of foreign envoys who were both fascinated and appalled by English habits. Others point to popular 17th-century retellings of her life, which lean more toward myth than fact. Once the legend was out there, it became irresistible because it fit the image of Elizabeth as both severe and strange. Of course, bathing wasn't just a personal choice. It was a cultural attitude, shaped by religion, medicine, and social status. Remember, Catholic monks once bathed weekly as a spiritual discipline. But after the Reformation, many Protestant countries began to view physical cleansing as vanity or, worse, temptation. The less you touched your body, the more pious you appeared. Elizabeth, balancing between Catholic and Protestant factions, likely picked up on this unspoken code. To bathe regularly might have seemed luxurious, indulgent even, suspicious. Better to smell like the Virgin Queen than risk looking like a French courtesan. You trail behind her as she heads to council. The air is heavy with orris root powder, a floral sweet scent used not just for perfume, but as dry shampoo. Her hair, reddish and coiled into a high crown, isn't washed with water. It's dusted, arranged, and stiffened with sugar water or egg whites. It looks majestic, but not exactly touchable. And now you see it, the illusion of cleanliness, the performance of purity. Elizabeth wore layers of fabric, not just to keep warm, but to hide the physical body. The pale face, powdered thick with trues, a deadly mix of vinegar and white lead, hid blemishes and scars. Her iconic look wasn't about beauty. It was about power. Untouchable, eternal power. She rarely showed skin, never let herself be seen, undressed, and carefully avoided any image that suggested vulnerability. Bathing, by contrast, is intimate, vulnerable, wet, not exactly the vibe she was going for. And yet, there are odd little contradictions. One courtier once noted her sweet-smelling skin and clear hands, suggesting she was well-kept. A Venetian ambassador described her as meticulous with her appearance, always surrounded by women tending to her garments and accessories. Could it be that Elizabeth did bathe more often, but in private, away from the prying eyes of her court? It's possible. She was notoriously private. She even refused to have portraits painted in her final years, unless they met strict standards: no wrinkles, no signs of aging, nothing to disrupt the myth of the everlasting queen. And if she was hiding her aging skin, who's to say she wasn't hiding her bathwater, too? Here's a strange tidbit for your dreams. Some royal households use dry rubs, a mix of fine cloth and powder rubbed vigorously over the body to simulate the effects of a bath. Think of it like a full-body Swiffer session. Less refreshing, perhaps, but safer than touching possibly contaminated water. And remember, this was a woman who survived smallpox, saw the Spanish Armada defeated, and ruled without a husband in a world that expected her to marry or step aside. Bathing was probably low on her priority list. Still, the once-a-month line persists. Maybe she said it with a smile. Maybe it was just courtly sarcasm. Or maybe it was an offhand comment that got recorded, repeated, and canonized because it confirmed what people already believed. After all, if a monarch doesn't bathe like a commoner, that makes sense. If she doesn't need to bathe, well, that makes her more than mortal. Elizabeth understood this logic well. She wasn't just queen, she was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, a living symbol of nationhood. Untouched and untouchable. And symbols don't sweat. So now, as you watch her disappear into the throne room, robes trailing, head held high, you start to wonder if maybe she wasn't dirty at all. Maybe she was just playing a game we weren't meant to understand. You linger outside the queen's presence now, as she vanishes behind another set of thick wooden doors. The air still smells faintly of lavender and clove the remnants of her passage. But what stays with you isn't just the perfume, it's the paint. Not paint in the literal sense, though it's close. It's her face. That signature white mask, with its chalky smoothness and eerie stillness, is part of the queen's armor. You've seen it up close, seen it crack under the heat of candlelight, and seen it reapplied layer by layer, a ritual almost religious in its precision. Which leads us to the heart of tonight's next strange truth. If Queen Elizabeth had bathed more often, her face would have quite literally melted. She wore churus, a toxic blend of white lead and vinegar, used to achieve the pale, ghost-like complexion that marked nobility. Pale skin wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a status symbol. It said, I don't work outdoors, I don't sweat, I don't belong to the common world. And maintaining it was no small feat. You step into her dressing chamber now, and the transformation begins again. First, a layer of ointment, possibly scented, possibly just thick with beeswax. Then the churus is dabbed on, carefully avoiding the eyes. It stings. You can tell, even though she never flinches. Over that, a blush of red. A smear of color on the lips made from cinnabar or vermilion, also toxic, by the way. Then powder, more powder, and finally a sealing layer of starch or ground pearls. The result is flawless, unchanging, and deeply fragile. If she bathed too often, if she let water touch her face, that steam softened that mask, it would run. It would melt. And in that melting, the illusion would dissolve too. This is why Elizabeth's skincare routine didn't involve water. It involved sponges, cloths, and gentle dabbing. You didn't wash your face, you reapplied it, like repainting a masterpiece every single day. Historians still debate whether Elizabeth realized the full danger of her cosmetics. Lead poisoning symptoms include skin deterioration, hair loss, and neurological effects, some of which she certainly suffered. But even if she did know, it may not have mattered. The mask mattered more. There's something intimate about watching her prepare. You notice that no one speaks while it's happening. The silence isn't reverent, it's strategic. Any slip, any flinch, any misspoke could compromise the look. The queen cannot afford to be seen with a blemish. Not because she's vain, but because her entire mythos rests on that porcelain illusion. So, what happens when her skin starts to rebel? You've heard the whispers: open sores, flaky patches, deep wrinkles hidden beneath heavier and heavier layers. There are even rumors that she wore false sleeves and gloves filled with wax paste to mask the damage on her arms and hands, and her lips, painted in a sharp, defined bow, not for beauty, but to disguise how thin they had become. And yet, she endures. Even in her 60s, she appears in court glittering with jewels and draped in silks, her face as white as ever. You get the sense that she isn't fooling anyone, not really. But no one dares to say otherwise. Because to question her appearance is to question the stability of the crown itself. That's the power of ritual. Here's something odd. Elizabeth reportedly had her teeth blackened, either from age, sweets, or the lead in her cosmetics. But by the end of her life, she'd lost so many teeth that foreign ambassadors had trouble understanding her speech. Still, she refused to let her image fade. She wore false hair, inserted fabric padding beneath her gowns, and refused to show any sign of physical frailty. Because once people see the queen as human, the spell breaks. And that brings us back to bathing. There's evidence that Elizabeth eventually became obsessed with maintaining appearances to the point of neurosis. She had mirrors removed from her chambers as she aged. She rejected portraits that didn't conform to her youthful ideal. She refused to sleep in unfamiliar beds, refused to dine in public when her teeth became too much of an issue, and likely bathed even less as her body became more delicate, because by then, a bath wasn't just impractical, it was a threat. Water revealed softness, it showed skin, flushed cheeks, fading strength, all the things Elizabeth was fighting against with every ounce of royal will. So instead, she chose powder. She chose stillness. She chose to be more statue than woman. Here's your quirky bit for the night. Some say Elizabeth had a secret chambermaid, whose only job was to ray powder her neck and shoulders when no one was watching. Not because she needed it, but because even in privacy, the queen refused to look ordinary. That's the lesson you keep bumping into. Cleanliness to Elizabeth wasn't about hygiene. It was about illusion, about preserving the crown not just on her head, but on her skin. And ironically, water, the universal cleanser, would have undone everything. So now, as the candlelight flickers low and her attendants drift silently from the room, you realize that Elizabeth didn't avoid bathing because she was lazy, or clueless, or strange. She avoided bathing because to do so would invite reality in, and reality, in the royal court, had no place at all. It's late now. The palace is quieter than it ever gets, but it doesn't sleep. Somewhere, a page turns softly in a candlelit chamber. The firewood crackles low, and beneath that always, there's a hum of movement. The queen might be resting, or she might be pacing, her thoughts wound tightly round diplomacy, succession, betrayal, or maybe just how best to avoid another marriage proposal. You drift along the stone corridors again, but this time you're not looking for soap or buckets, or basins. You're looking for something less tangible, the real reason Elizabeth I, the sharp, shining icon of power, refused to immerse herself in water. And what you find, winding back through every room, every powdered glove and stiff corset, is this: fear. Not the kind you show, the kind you carry silently. Fear of aging, fear of being exposed, fear of losing control. To understand Elizabeth's aversion to bathing, you have to understand what water meant in her world. It wasn't just cold or inconvenient. It was unpredictable. Water blurred edges, it softened lines. It washed away paint, costume, ceremony. And Elizabeth, who built her reign on symbols and illusion, couldn't afford anything that made her look less. Even in portraits, she stands stiff and glowing, radiating light like a stained glass window come to life. Her garments bristle with embroidery and jewels. Her eyes give nothing away. She is untouchable. And in being untouchable, she becomes eternal, which is precisely why water, the very thing that binds and cleanses most people, was to intimate. For her, think about this, even the act of washing one's hands could be loaded with meaning in her court. To cleanse oneself publicly might seem virtuous or suspicious, as if you had something to hide. Cleanliness wasn't just next to godliness, it was a performance of status, timing, and propriety. Done too often, and it became suspect. Done too rarely, and you were clearly poor or foreign. So it was done ritually, not practically. Elizabeth played that balance with exquisite precision. You remember now that she often gifted scented items, embroidered handkerchiefs, gloves, even little pomanders, tiny metal balls filled with herbs and resins. These were carried close to the body and sniffed when the stench of others became overwhelming. But more than that, they were tokens, symbols of cleanliness, not actual instruments of it. And for all her studied perfection, Elizabeth never forgot her vulnerability. She'd seen what happened to queens who let their guards down. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed when Elizabeth was just 2.5. Her stepmother Catherine Howard, also executed. Even her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, beheaded after years of imprisonment. Power and punishment went hand in hand for women in her world. And the moment you were seen as soft, or to human, you were in danger. Bathing is human. It requires privacy. It implies softness. It's a moment when the crown is quite literally set aside. And so she avoided it, not out of dirtiness, but out of design. Here's your final quirky fact of the night. During her later years, Elizabeth kept a specially scented walking stick, which she would raise delicately when passing especially pungent courtiers. A gentle, perfumed wall between her and the less composed bodies of others. But even that was symbolic. She didn't fear others' smells because she believed they'd infect her. She feared what they represented, that the illusion was always just one breath away from breaking. Historians still debate whether Elizabeth truly feared water or simply chose not to trust it. Some argue that her hygiene habits were better than most of her contemporaries, that the filthy queen narrative is a modern invention. Others point to her obsessive control over her image and see the lack of bathing as part of that same tight, unbending script. What's clear is that her body, her real, physical body, was never meant to be the focus. It was the idea of her body that mattered. The unblemished skin, the eternal youth, the stillness, the scent, the silence. That's why, in the end, she was mourned not as a woman, but as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the embodiment of England's golden age. No one ever saw her bathe. No one ever saw her age. Not officially. And now, as the torches are dimmed and the palace quiets completely, you return to her private chamber one last time. She's alone now. Not asleep, not quite, just still. Her face is pale, dusted. Her hair arranged, her gown flows around her like a pool of velvet. There's no smell of soap, no trace of water. But there's order, control, perfection. She has chosen, once again, to be more than flesh. She has chosen to be myth. The fire in the queen's chamber dies down slowly, casting soft, amber shadows on the walls. The scent of lavender still lingers faint now, barely there. You imagine her breathing slow, measured as she rests beneath heavy silks, her figure unmoving, her mind perhaps still turning with the endless weight of sovereignty. Outside, the wind murmurs along the Thames, gentle and constant. A few embers pop in the hearth, and you, standing quietly in this final scene, feel time stretch out like thread, soft, delicate, and surprisingly peaceful. The palace doesn't sleep easily, but in this moment, it settles. The rustle of skirts, the clatter of boots, the murmur of courtiers all gone. Just quiet, just candlelight fading to nothing. You begin to let your own breathing slow. Feel the hush settle over your shoulders. Think of the linens, freshly changed. Think of the rose water gently dabbed onto skin. Cool and careful. Think of the velvet, the powder, the silence. Whatever you imagine about Queen Elizabeth's bathing habits, one thing becomes beautifully clear. She lived, not as we do, but as a performance. Every day a scene, every moment a portrait. And yet, beneath all the ceremony, she was just a woman, trying to stay unbroken in a world that demanded impossible strength. Let that thought drift with you as you ease into sleep. You're safe. You are still. And your world doesn't need to be perfect. Good night.